Nancy Guthrie, 84, mother of Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, was last seen the night of Jan. 31, 2026, dropped home in the Catalina foothills, Tucson, by her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso Cioni. Reported missing Feb. 1. Blood on the porch, a disconnected doorbell camera, and a masked armed figure on surveillance footage. No suspect has been named as of this recording. The FBI's position on the ransom notes is not a clean, confirmed fake. A June 30th Reuters report, citing an anonymous FBI official, said 3 notes were fake. The FBI Phoenix office publicly pushed back the next day, saying some notes were extortion attempts without legitimacy, while others may potentially be legitimate and remain under investigation. The case is still officially classified as a kidnapping for ransom investigation. A California man, Derek Colella, pleaded guilty July 2nd to 2 counts of harassment for a separate extortion attempt targeting the family. This is confirmed and resolved, but it is not the person who took Nancy, and it does not resolve the core mystery. The stalker targeting Savannah theory is real and attributable to retired FBI profilers James Fitzgerald and Jim Clemente, and separately Raymond Carr, in on-record interviews since April-May 2026. Not a fringe theory invented for content. Mark Garagos' Confederate framing is presented here as his legal analysis, doc theory, not as an established fact about the investigation. All claims about the suspect, motive, and notes are kept in alleged according to framing, since no charges have been filed in the disappearance itself. On the morning of February 1, 2026, an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Arizona desert, without her phone and without the medication she needed to survive. 5 months later, we still don't know where she is. We still don't know who took her. And as of last week, we don't even know if the ransom notes tied to her disappearance were real or an elaborate hoax layered on top of an actual kidnapping. 2 of the most respected investigative minds in the country, a legendary FBI profiler who helped catch the Unabomber and one of the most famous defense attorneys in America, have looked at the exact same evidence in this case and walked away with 2 completely different theories about what happened to her. One says this was always about money, the other says money was never the point at all. And in just the last 9 days, both theories have gotten new, real ammunition. Today we're laying out both roads, the full 5-month timeline, the newest developments, and the question nobody in Tucson can answer: where is Nancy Guthrie? Nancy Guthrie is the mother of 3 adult children. Annie, a poet, married to Tommaso Cioni; Cameron, a retired military colonel; and Savannah, the co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television. Those who know her describe an 84-year-old who, in Sheriff Chris Nanos's words, was sharp as a tack, active, social, and deeply embedded in her Tucson community. She watched an online church service with a neighbor every single week, without fail, which is precisely why her absence that first Sunday morning raised alarm so quickly. On the night of January 31st, Nancy had dinner with her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso, who dropped her back at her home in the Catalina foothills, a quiet, upscale neighborhood on the edge of Tucson, at around 9:48 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. According to investigators, at 1:47 a.m., someone disabled her doorbell camera. Motion sensors picked up activity again, roughly 25 minutes later. At 2:28 a.m., the app tracking her pacemaker lost its connection to her phone, a detail authorities say suggests she was moved out of range of her home network. That detail matters more than it might seem. It means whoever did this either didn't know or didn't care that her medical device would leave a digital trail the moment she left her house. She didn't show up the next morning for that online church service. When family arrived just before noon, they found the back door propped open and a trail of blood drops near the front entrance. Sheriff Nanos didn't mince words. "I believe she was abducted." DNA testing later confirmed the blood on the porch belonged to Nancy herself. Within days, the FBI released grainy black and white images from her Nest doorbell camera, a masked, gloved man, roughly 5'9" to 5'10", wearing a black Ozark Trail backpack, tampering with the camera outside her door. To this day, that person has never been identified. All members of the Guthrie family, including spouses, have been officially cleared as suspects. A pair of gloves found near the home was tested, and months later traced back to an unrelated restaurant worker with no connection to the case. Investigators even looked into whether Nancy may have crossed into Mexico. There's no evidence that she did. In one strange detour, months into the search, human bones were found near her home. A discovery that briefly stopped investigators cold before a spokesperson confirmed the remains were not criminal in nature, part of an unrelated prehistoric anthropological site. This is a case with a mountain of physical evidence, a small army of investigators, and almost no answers. Before we get into the competing theories, it's worth walking through just how much has actually happened in 5 months, because the pace of this case has been anything but quiet. February 1st. Nancy is reported missing. Sheriff Nanos confirms it's being treated as an abduction. February 3rd. Authorities begin analyzing the first ransom note, which reportedly contains specific details about Nancy's clothing, a detail investigators saw as a potential sign of legitimacy since it suggested direct contact with her. February 5th and 9th. The two deadlines set in that first ransom note pass. No payment is made. No further contact follows. February 6th. The second note arrives, reportedly claiming Nancy had already died. February 10th. FBI Director Kash Patel personally releases surveillance images of the masked suspect on social media, an unusually high-profile move that signals just how much pressure this case is already generating at the top of the Bureau. Mid-February. A pair of black gloves is discovered near the home. Early testing raises hopes they belong to the suspect. Late February to March, those hopes are dashed. The gloves don't match anyone in CODIS, the national DNA database, and are eventually traced to a restaurant worker unrelated to the case. Around the same time, the FBI reaches out to Mexican authorities and rules out any evidence Nancy crossed the border. April 6th. After a 2-month absence, Savannah Guthrie confirmed she'll return to the Today Show. Late April into May. Retired FBI profilers James Fitzgerald and Jim Clemente go public with the stalker theory for the first time, in an interview with News Nation's Brian Entin. Around the same time, sources tell reporters that investigators are combing through more than 30,000 tips, and that the case has effectively stalled, with few of those tips leading anywhere actionable. Early May. Human bones are discovered near Nancy's property, briefly reigniting fears of the worst, before being ruled unrelated, tied instead to a prehistoric archaeological find in the area. Mother's Day, May 10th. Savannah posts an emotional 45-second tribute video to Instagram, home movies, old photographs, her mother's voice saying "miss you," captioned, "We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you." June 15th, Father's Day. Savannah shares a tribute to her husband, Michael Feldman, calling him a hero through the ordeal. A small but telling sign of how deeply this has reshaped daily life for the entire family. June 30th, the Reuters bombshell. An anonymous FBI official reportedly says all 3 ransom notes are fake. July 1st, the FBI publicly, partially contradicts that report. Savannah issues a statement marking 5 months since her mother's disappearance. "It is 5 months of agony and unending trauma for our family." July 2nd, Derek Colella pleads guilty to harassment for a separate extortion attempt against the family. July 4th, Harvey Levin, on a podcast with Mark Garagos, reveals a previously unreported claim from an FBI insider. More on that shortly. July 8th, just 1 day before this video, a federal judge orders Colella into inpatient treatment, and Sheriff Nanos gives a lengthy defensive interview about the state of the investigation. That is 5 months, 1 week, and 1 day of activity. And at the end of it, the central question hasn't moved an inch. Nobody knows where Nancy Guthrie is. This is where the story gets strange, and where the last 5 months of coverage has spiraled into genuine confusion, even for the people closest to the case. According to reporting from TMZ and other outlets, the day after Nancy disappeared, a note arrived at local media outlets and at TMZ demanding millions in cryptocurrency, with two separate payment deadlines, February 5th and February 9th. Both deadlines passed with no payment made and no further contact. 4 days later, on February 6th, a second note reportedly arrived, this one claiming Nancy had already died shortly after being taken, and that she was, in the note's words, buried with nature. Multiple outlets, including CNN and NBC News, held off on reporting the contents of that note for weeks, at the request of investigators and the Guthrie family, so any future communication claiming to be from the real kidnapper could be authenticated. Savannah Guthrie's response, posted to Instagram at the time, was gutting in its restraint. "We received your message, and we understand. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." Interestingly, Savannah herself has offered conflicting signals about which notes she believes are genuine. In an interview months into the case, she said, "There are a lot of different notes I think that came, and I think most of them, it's my understanding, are not real, and I didn't see them. But I believe the two notes that we received, that we responded to, I tend to believe those are real." That's the family's own read, and even that came with hedging. Then, months later, a third message surfaced, this one sent to TMZ from someone claiming to know the identity of the kidnappers and demanding 1 Bitcoin for the information. TMZ has said it actually received close to a dozen emails from this same person over time, one of whom reportedly wrote that time is more valuable, cryptic language that only deepened the confusion. Sheriff Nanos, speaking on Arizona radio station KVOI, put it plainly. The downside of a case with this much national attention is that people send in false information and fake ransom notes just to tie up investigators. On June 30th, Reuters published a report, citing an unnamed FBI official, stating that the agency had determined all 3 of these notes were fake. That story detonated across true crime media overnight. Headlines everywhere said flatly, "The ransom notes are fake," but that's not actually where the story ended. The very next day, July 1st, the FBI's Phoenix field office issued its own public statement, directly addressing and partially walking back the Reuters framing. In a post on X, the Bureau said, "Some of the notes have been deemed to be extortion attempts without legitimacy. Other ransom demands may potentially be legitimate and are still being investigated as such." Crucially, they added, "This case continues to be investigated as a kidnapping for ransom case." That is a meaningfully different statement than "the notes are fake." It means at least one of these communications may still be genuine, and the case has not been reclassified. Court records help explain part of this. The FBI reportedly deposited a small amount of cryptocurrency into the account named in that first note, hoping to trace it back to whoever sent it. The money was never touched, one of the details that led investigators to label that account fraudulent. But the Bureau has not disclosed how it determined the second note, the one claiming Nancy had died, was fake, if that's even the note they're referring to. Retired FBI agent Jason Pack, addressing the apparent contradiction publicly, summed up the confusion well. "I don't see how you can definitively say a note is or is not legitimate until you know exactly what happened. You don't know who sent it yet." The Pima County Sheriff's Department, for its part, released a carefully worded statement of its own. Every tip and lead is taken seriously and is forwarded directly to our detectives, who continue to work in coordination with the FBI. Translation, according to several people close to the case. Even law enforcement isn't entirely in sync on this. Crime scene investigator Cheryl McCollum offered maybe the sharpest critique of the notes themselves, regardless of which ones are real. "If this was about ransom, they have just failed spectacularly," she said. "I need them to write a letter to explain the blood on the front porch. Tell me how that blood got there." Her theory is that investigators may be intentionally keeping the note conversation alive, not because they believe every message, but because it's one of the only threads still capable of drawing out whoever is responsible. "I truly believe they're trying to draw this person out," she said, "because he's been quiet for 2 months, and this brings us to a genuinely new piece of this story, one that's only a few days old as of this video. On July 2nd, a 42-year-old California man named Derek Colella pleaded guilty in federal court to 2 counts of harassment using a telecommunications device. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona, Colella had texted Nancy's daughter Annie and her husband Tommaso back on February 4th, just after the family posted their first public plea to the kidnappers, demanding money and referencing an earlier ransom request. Prosecutors say Colella admitted his actions were meant to harass the family. Federal investigators have specifically stated that he was not responsible for the earlier ransom demand sent to local media outlets, meaning this is a separate person, a separate crime, exploiting an already devastating situation, not the person who abducted Nancy Guthrie. Court filings note Colella tested positive for drugs during his case, and on July 8th, the day before this video was made, a federal judge ordered him into inpatient substance abuse treatment ahead of his sentencing, scheduled for September 10th before U.S. District Judge John C. Hinderaker. The amended release conditions require him to live at an inpatient facility or halfway house, follow all program requirements, and contribute to the cost of his own treatment. Sheriff Nanos addressed cases like this directly in his interview this week, saying the FBI has already made 2 or 3 arrests of people exploiting Nancy Guthrie and the family with fake or fraudulent notes. His message was blunt. The FBI takes these notes extremely seriously. They track them down, and if they find it to be fraudulent, they don't just put it aside, they will arrest you. They have made arrests. Don't do it. He added, "If you send a note, whether it's fraudulent or otherwise, we're going to be looking at it very seriously, and you will be arrested. We're not just dismissing it." So here's where that leaves the ransom note mystery. At least one person has now been criminally punished for cynically capitalizing on this case. But the original notes, the ones with details about Nancy's clothing, the ones sent within days of her disappearance, remain, in the FBI's own words, only partially resolved. Some are fake, some might not be, and nobody's saying which is which. It's against that fog, real evidence tangled with real exploitation, that 2 very different theories about what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie have emerged. High-profile defense attorney Mark Geragos has spent decades inside the exact kind of high-stakes federal investigation Nancy Guthrie's case has become. And in his view, the FBI's public insistence, even now, that this remains a kidnapping for ransom case isn't just a description, it might be a message. The theory: if the FBI genuinely believed there was 0 chance of a ransom motive, they wouldn't keep the kidnapping for ransom classification alive in a public statement. Geragos's read is that the conflicting leaks, one anonymous official telling Reuters the notes are fake, the Bureau publicly contradicting that days later, reflect real disagreement inside the task force about what's actually happened here. And that kind of internal friction, he suggests, sometimes gets used strategically to signal to somebody on the outside that the door is still open, that somebody, in Geragos's framing, isn't necessarily the mastermind. It's what he calls a confederate, a lower-level participant, a driver, a lookout, someone who knows exactly where Nancy Guthrie is, or what happened to her, but who didn't plan any of it. And this is where Geragos's expertise as a defense attorney becomes genuinely useful in understanding how a case like this could still break. In major federal investigations, he explains, the first person willing to cooperate typically gets the most leverage, the best deal, the most protection. Every day that passes without someone coming forward is a day that advantage shrinks for whoever eventually does. But nobody in that position walks into a police station and confesses cold. According to Geragos, that person goes through a defense lawyer first, who can quietly test the waters with prosecutors without exposing the client's identity. One tool for that is what's known as a reverse proffer, where a lawyer gives investigators a preview of what their client might know, phrased carefully, without naming who's talking. Another is a proffer agreement, sometimes informally called Queen for a Day, a limited protection arrangement that lets someone describe what they know to the government without their own words later being used to prosecute them, as long as they're telling the truth. It's a legal path that exists in exactly this kind of situation. Someone terrified, sitting on information that could end an agonizing 5-month search, but who has every reason to be afraid of what happens if they speak up the wrong way. This is also where the July 4th revelation becomes relevant to Geragos's side of the story specifically, because it was Geragos himself, on a podcast with TMZ founder Harvey Levin, present when Levin dropped a claim that hadn't been reported before. That an FBI insider had told him the Bureau once suspected someone in the media may have planted evidence early in the investigation. Levin made a point of noting that nobody has ever actually been charged in connection with that claim, which to him suggests investigators didn't have compelling proof it happened. Retired FBI agent and News Nation contributor Jennifer Coffin-Daffer publicly called Levin's comments troublesome, while also expressing relief that the Bureau had at least publicly reaffirmed the kidnapping for ransom classification, which she said helped quell the speculation. Whether or not that specific claim holds up, it underlines Geragos' broader point. This task force has had internal disagreements serious enough to leak out in public more than once over the last 2 weeks alone. That's not normal for a case this far along, and to a defense attorney who spent a career reading exactly these kinds of signals, it suggests the door to a deal, for the right person, may still be very much open. If Geragos is right, the break in this case may not come from new DNA, or new footage, or a fourth ransom note. It may come from someone's lawyer picking up the phone. Now for the theory that a growing number of investigators, not just one retired agent, have been building since the spring. James Fitzgerald spent years as an FBI profiler, and he's credited with cracking the linguistic analysis that helped identify the Unabomber. Since at least April, Fitzgerald, often alongside fellow retired profiler Jim Clemente, a former member of the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, has been saying publicly, in interviews with News Nation and other outlets, that he doesn't believe this was a kidnapping for money at all. His reasoning starts with what's missing. In a real financially motivated kidnapping, Fitzgerald argues, the people responsible want control and privacy, and they desperately want to prove the victim is alive, because a hostage with no proof of life is worth nothing to a kidnapper. These notes did the opposite. They were sent publicly to media outlets and a tabloid site instead of privately to the family. They offered no real proof of anything. And glaringly, according to Fitzgerald, no note was ever left inside Nancy's home the night she was taken, which is exactly where a planned professional ransom kidnapping would leave one, specifically to avoid a public, traceable, easily faked message trail like the one that's played out for 5 months. His conclusion, I think it was opportunists taking advantage of a situation from a very wealthy woman through Savannah. In his view, the actual ransom notes are noise layered on top of the real crime, either fake entirely or sent by unrelated people like Derek Colella, trying to profit off someone else's tragedy. So, if it wasn't about money, what was it about? Fitzgerald's theory is darker, and it doesn't center on Nancy at all. It centers on her daughter. This has something to do with Savannah on a stalking-type scenario, he's said in multiple interviews, dating back to at least February. His argument is that someone unable to get close to a famous television anchor may have redirected that fixation toward the person closest to her, her elderly mother, living alone in a home the public didn't know the exact address of, but someone clearly did. Fellow profiler Raymond Carr has built out the behavioral side of this theory further, describing what he calls a fantasy-driven pattern, someone who likely researched restraints and surveillance in advance, and who almost certainly ran dry runs on routes to the house before ever acting. Carr has also described how this kind of fixation typically escalates. He didn't just wake up one morning and say, "This is what I'm going to do." It started out much simpler, much less dangerous. It was more of like a stalking type of thing. And there's a lot of celebrities that have issues like that where they're stalked, and then it just escalates over time. Fitzgerald has specifically recommended investigators comb through years of correspondence sent to Savannah Guthrie. Emails, social media messages, anything that predates this by years, including messages sent after Nancy Guthrie's own occasional appearances on the Today Show, because in his view, the person responsible didn't wake up one day and decide to do this. They built toward it. Fitzgerald has also floated something investigators may already be watching for: the behavior of a suspect under this much public pressure. He's described likely signs: visible mental strain, disrupted sleep, possible substance use, and what he calls over-explaining whereabouts or creating unsolicited alibis. He suggested the person may be hypervigilant around police, obsessively cleaning a vehicle or home, or getting rid of clothing and other items tied to the crime. If someone recognizes this behavior, he said, look at the video. A direct appeal to the idea that somebody, somewhere, already suspects a person they know. Under this theory, the ransom notes, whichever ones are real, aren't the point of the crime. They're a distraction, smoke thrown over an investigation while the actual motive and the actual person responsible hides in plain sight and the trail keeps growing colder. And with more than 30,000 tips reportedly logged, and per sources close to the case, few of them actionable, that cold trail is exactly what investigators appear to be fighting against. So where does that leave us? 5 months and 1 week after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her own bedroom? One expert says a defense attorney's phone call could crack this case open if the right person finally decides the risk of silence outweighs the risk of talking. Another says the answer was never about a payday at all, that somewhere in Savannah Guthrie's inbox or an old social media message is the first thread of an obsession that ended with an 84-year-old woman vanishing into the desert night. Crime scene investigator Cheryl McCollum, watching this case from the outside, put words to something a lot of people following along have felt for months. This investigation is so botched, she said recently, pointing to the fact that the FBI, the Sheriff's Department, and the Guthrie family have never once stood together at a single podium to deliver one unified account of what's actually happening. They're not on the same page, she said. It's really sad to see this. She went further, describing exactly what that silence has meant for the family. Savannah is still left with, is it one person or three? Is she alive? Is she not alive? If she died, when did she die? Is she buried? Where is she buried? I mean, they know nothing. There's no comfort. There's no answers. Sheriff Nanos, for his part, insists the case is very much alive. In a detailed interview just this week, he acknowledged what everyone already knows. Here you are 5 months later, and you still have no answers, but pushed back on any suggestion the investigation has gone cold. The best I could tell the family is that we continue to work this case. We're not giving up. He closed that interview, unprompted, with a message directly to the Guthries. Our thoughts are still, have been, and will always be with the whole Guthrie family. I can't imagine, I don't even want to think about being in that place. B-roll, slow pan of missing person flyer, candle vigil footage if available, Tucson sunset. For Savannah Guthrie, none of the theories matter as much as one fact: her mother is still gone. In a statement marking 5 months since the disappearance, she said simply, "It is 5 months of agony and unending trauma for our family. There is not a moment that goes by that we aren't actively trying to find our mom." Even amid the search, life hasn't paused. Savannah has spoken publicly about the strangeness of returning to hosting duties, including an upcoming game show project, while her mother remains missing. "Everything is strange right now," she said. "It's strange to get up and do the Today Show every day. But I'm determined to put one foot in front of the other. Somewhere between those two roads, A ransom scheme gone catastrophically sideways, or an obsession that used an innocent woman as a weapon against her famous daughter, is the truth. And as of the day this video was made, nobody outside of whoever committed this crime knows which road it is. If Mark Garagos is right, the case ends the way so many federal cases do, with someone, somewhere, deciding they can't carry the secret any longer and picking up the phone. If James Fitzgerald is right, it ends the way so many stalking cases do, with investigators finally tracing a years-old message back to a name nobody expected. Either way, the answer already exists. It's sitting in an inbox, a memory, a moment somebody hasn't spoken about yet. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for over 5 months. Somebody knows something. If you have any information related to this case, you're urged to contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Pima County tip line at 88 Crime.